Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak and the glowing recommendations. Thanks everyone for giving time. Now, I'm framing this conversation in the context of preclinical research, but actually it's also about driving change and some of the strategies that are being utilized to try and drive that to actually have meaningful impact in what's happening on the ground. Well, hopefully, that's the plan. So where we're going to start is sort of a recap of what's the status in preclinical research, what are the forces and why are we really being able to actually start to see change occurring, but what are the barriers at play? And then I'm going to share with you the sex inclusive research framework, which is a nudge strategy to further drive the change in how researchers are thinking about inclusive research. But then I'm also going to present some meta research which is trying to understand the drivers better, and then talk a little bit about next steps and some conclusions. So preclinical research, there's a well-established embedded neglect of sex within preclinical research. We can see manuscripts raising the topic for over 30 years, highlighting from all aspects of the experimental research process, whether it's the reporting, the design, or the analysis. So, for example, when we focus on the experimental design, there was a meta-analysis looking across 9 fields of biology at the published literature, first in 2009 and then again in 2019 to assess the state of play, asking in a paper, was there somewhere that both males and females had been used? And they did see an improvement over that 10-year period, with on average, there was an increase from 26 to 48% of the papers, but still under half the papers did not include male and female samples somewhere in that manuscript. And in fact, one area, the pharmacology, had a reduction to only a third of the published manuscripts. This isn't just an issue for in vivo. In vitro, where the sex of the cells are reported, they predominantly come from a male source originally. If you actually do collect data from both males and females, what we then also find is that the analysis is subpar, in that often the data is pooled or the data is disaggregated and analyzed separately, and conclusions are made that maybe there is an interaction effect with sex, but not with a statistical test, but often by eyeballing the data. So we have 2 problems. We have a problem with both inclusion, and we have a problem with how to analyze the data appropriately when males and females are included in a study. Now, this is arising from a structural research strategy. So inherently, when you're in the research space, we are using a simplification of a complex sources of variance having an impact on something, so we can isolate cause and effect. And we're discarding sex along with other sources of variation. So typically in the preclinical space, we'll have a pool of samples. So if this was an animal study, it will be typically 1 genetic background, 1 age, 1 sex, on 1 diet, in 1 environment, that will be randomly allocated to the intervention groups. The intervention will be applied, the measurements collected, the data analyzed, and the results generalized. So we're asking for a shift in how people think about and conduct this research strategy. Now, that's the mechanism of how we conduct our experiments. But when you talk to scientists, absolutely all the scientists believe that sex is an interesting variable and it matters, but they don't particularly perceive that it's a doable problem. So you can look at this from a sociological exploration. So this was from a report, a master's document from Annika Gomper, who interviewed scientists in the US after the NIH, a National Institute of Health, put out the inclusion program and found some themes. They found the themes were that scientists really thought it was important to embrace variation to understand biological differences. But they felt the second theme was there was a need to avoid complexity. To make progress in science, we have to reduce complexity. So there was a practicality issue. There was a tension between being able to generalize and needing to avoid complexity. So this is the understanding of this experimental paradigm of how we conduct experiments that were at odds with this inclusion philosophy. The MRC more recently in 2022 conducted a survey and found that 95% of researchers saw the benefit of inclusion and were raising translation, reproducibility, and the ability to detect sex-specific effects. But then the but came. It was the concerns around the cost of experiments, the complexity of the design, and the compliance with the 3 Rs. And they felt that, again, that inclusion was not doable. So I've been thinking about this topic and working on this for a number of years. In 2018, I published this paper, which was an exploration of how to change the status quo. So I was asked to write a review article, and I thought, let's bring a change management reflection to this. Now, the reason I decided to do this was that I went to a meeting and I was talking about some experimental design issues that I often need to talk about. And I met someone that I hadn't seen in about 10 years, and they said, "It's lovely to see you. I haven't seen you in such a long time. You're doing so well. You're still banging on about experimental design." And I thought, oh, it's like a compliment and a criticism at equal measures there. I'm still banging on about experimental design. Okay, I don't want to be banging on for the next 20, 30 years. I need a different strategy. I want to have more impact than this. This is like a drop in the ocean. This is doing nothing. So what do I need to do? And I felt like I had a light bulb moment that actually realizing that I needed to think about this in a different way. And I thought I need to look at what happens in industry and business and how they drive change. And I started reading around about change management. So there are lots and lots of different theories, many overlap in how they approach things. And I'm just going to share some of the things that I've found particularly helpful when thinking about change and trying to navigate driving change in research practice. So the first thing I found to appreciate is that we have a culture. And a culture is the way we do things around here. The culture sets our intentions, our behaviors, which leads to behavioral norms that are maybe not even directly articulate, but they just happen within your environment. And in fact, those behavioral norms set a behavioral path which drives the culture. So the culture is really driving what is happening. And there's something called the onion model, which is talking about that if you want to drive change, you need to think of it as an onion, that at the core of the onion is the underlying assumptions. And these are the things that you think are of truth. So the community thinks sex matters, but it isn't doable. It is a truth. They won't even articulate it unless you really pressure test it. What they tell you as values that they really value generalisability and translation, but it doesn't matter if it conflicts with the underlying assumption. And then we can have the visible artifacts that are on the outside, which are almost the mission and the vision statements, the formal guidelines and processes, what an institute might put out as its position. But if that is at odds with those core beliefs, nothing happens, because it's like the outer layer of the onion. You can peel it away and it does nothing. If you want to truly change things, we have to tackle those underlying assumptions, and we have to actually get those aired and debated so we actually start to understand how they're interacting with the behavior and the situation we find ourselves in. So the big first step was me recognizing that I was trying to take people on a change journey, and I was asking people to do more. I was raising the expectations, changing the status quo. And for this, we need a plan. And we need a community, such as one we're talking to here, because it's going to be a journey. It's going to take time. And we slightly need realistic expectations of what we can do, but also the time it is going to take to drive that. So there is a personal reaction to change. So this was originally developed in the concept of grief. And this is how you react to change or a grief situation, but has now been applied into the business setting. So when we're originally approached with a change situation, our typical reaction is denial or disbelief, and we will react with resistance to the situation. And we are looking backwards to the way things used to be. what we need to do is we need to take a community to the next point, which is where we start to look forward, where we start to explore or experiment with the new ways of working or operating to hopefully make a commitment to embrace this new way of being. And the thing to think about this personal reaction to change is that people move through it at different rates. So some people, you can move them through this reaction within a single meeting. Others will take longer. And sometimes you can be in a situation where you feel that you have been banging heads with someone and you can turn around and suddenly realize that they're actually on board with you now and that they've gone through this change journey, but you maybe haven't realized that that was what was happening. So one of the personal lessons I had to learn is that when I originally pose ideas or suggestions was to actually understand that I would receive resistance and disbelief and pushback, and it is not personal to me, it is due to the change situation. And actually, I just need to ride that. And I need to keep going through and not take it as the first thing that actually this isn't going to happen. So the danger zone is this resistance, because you can then go, oh, this isn't going to work. This isn't, there's no point. I can't do this. It isn't going to happen. But actually, it's understanding that this is a process. So Gary York wrote a paper which sort of or a book. He talked about how our reaction to change can be with resistance, where we actively undermine the change initiative. Reluctance compliance, we do something when people are monitoring, watching us, or checking in. Or commitment, where we become advocates for that change. And what we need is to get people, for change to embed, we have to get people into the commitment stage. So what sort of tactics can be used? So he generally grouped tactics into two strategies. So some are positive and some are negative. Positives drive towards commitment, negative drive towards resistance. So let's focus on the negative. Pressure. If people perceive pressure, and then they just go, I can't do this. This is too difficult. There's no way that I can achieve this change. You don't understand the situation or the complexities I have to deal with. Pressure can come in many different forms. People are very sensitive to pressure. So legitimizing, if I say that group are there are doing it, they can go, well, it's different for them. So we have to be quite careful in how we approach this. Coalition building can be perceived as pressure, because if you get loads of people talking to it, the people on the ground go, they just don't understand. It's the leaders up here saying these statements. They don't really get what's going on. It's that pressure. So what we have to do is what triggers the different reaction, a positive engagement with a potential change journey. It is rational discussion. It is talking to people, but not talking at people. It is talking with people, because you need that consultation where you start to hear, well, what is it that they perceive are the barriers? What is it that they feel are the blockers? And it can be an exchange. And we're actually in an exchange situation, which is why the landscape is shifting. The funding bodies are saying you are more likely to get funded if you run inclusive designs. And so basically there is something in it for the person, which is then, or they're going to get kudos if they can present things in a certain way. And therefore that becomes that there's more value to it for them to commit. And here's an interesting inspirational appeals rather than legitimizing can be a positive. So the difference, I think, between an inspirational appeal and legitimizing is when the inspiration appeal connects to your values and your drivers and what matters, then you can see how aligning what you want to, you're aligning your own, that activity, that change with your own drivers and things that matter to you to then drive the change. So one of the strategies that I found very useful, and it's a very simple strategy to think about change and also to communicate change to, say, maybe my managers or stakeholders, is a Lewin's force field analysis. In a Lewin's force field analysis, you identify the forces and then you try and quantify them on a sort of qualitative scale of 1 to 4. So you have forces driving changes and resisting changes. If the forces resisting change are larger than the forces driving change, nothing is going to happen. So what you need to then do is it shows why we're stuck. But also, it then starts to tell you the way to move forward, because the way to move forward is that you have to strengthen the driving forces and you have to weaken the resisting forces. Only then can they describe it as a defrosting of the status quo and a refreezing in a new situation. And back in 2018, when I did this analysis, we came up with culture. That's not how we do it. The belief, a very strong belief that it's going to double the number of animals, that male mice are too aggressive to work with, it's too complex, female mice are variable, it's going to stop me from getting the sensitivity I need, and maybe this isn't useful at all anyway, it won't translate. And if you try and look at what were the forces driving in 2018, women's health, reproducibility crisis, a bit from journals, a little bit from funders at that time. And you suddenly go, okay, that is why we're in this status quo. The driving forces are very nebulous and a long way from the researcher. The resisting forces are on the ground with the scientists. And so it's no wonder we've had 30 years of papers saying we need to change and nothing is changing. Now, the thing that is changing the landscape. So where I started talking about these conversations, it was always, that's really nice topic, Natasha, but we are now seeing a shift to, but how do I do this, Natasha? And this is because funders are driving change and they are upping that force to do this. They've said that the default should be inclusion. So instead of a justification for inclusion, we are moving to a justification for exclusion. So what they're asking for, in general, if you look across the funders, is that where the subjects of the research comprising these organisms can be differentiated by sex, you should by default include samples from males and females, whether you're working with human, animal tissue, or cells. Your analysis should account for sex, and your raw data should be reported with the sex details. Now, there's been a lack of clarity about what the vision is from the funders. But in general, this vision is not to study sex differences, but rather to estimate a generalizable effect. So this is the inclusion as a default in general research is so that when you're estimating your effect, it is an average effect. And what we've shown here is that when you run this sort of workflow, what happens is if the effect is very different between the males and females, the power moves from the average effect to the interaction term. And so that means that it was you're not losing power by including both for the main effect if it doesn't depend. And if it does depend, you find out something very important, that the results are very different. And by very different, I mean the effect is happening in opposite directions or that it happens in one sex and not the other. So what the funders are asking for is a justification for exclusion. So they're asking for a reflective cost-benefit analysis. And a cost is not just a financial cost. This could be a logistical, ethical, practical, financial cost versus the benefit of including male and female samples. So that is a huge impact. The challenge we have with that is that people are giving their justifications with many misconceptions rather than a reflective cost-benefit analysis on their true situation. And that's because their core belief is that it is not doable. So to think about this further, we now have to step across to the barriers. So going back to that 2018 paper, so currently, many of these justifications that we see are misconceptions or fear about change. So under the misconceptions, it could be, and I've seen this right up to professors who sit on boards advising on best practice. Inclusion would double the number of animals because to include means I have two experiments just happening at the same time, which is not true. You have one experiment with another factor. The variability from sex would mean I would lose the power. Okay, that's true if you don't use the right statistical toolkit. Female mice, because of the estrogen cycle, are more variable, which would increase the N. Well, we'll come to that in a minute. And again, that's a misconception. The other things I can see is belief in the value. The effect of sex will not translate. What if the effect of sex would not translate? The whole validity of your model is at question at this point. But maybe minor differences won't translate. That's possibly true, but your goal is not to look for minor differences. Your goal is to get a generalizable estimate. Sex isn't an important variable. If it isn't an important variable, then it doesn't matter. You include it and you've got a generalizable result. Everything's fine. But we also see my prior work has only been considered in one sex. I don't know anything about the other sex. Exactly. We don't know anything about the other sex, whichever one you are using. We don't know. Or to date, sex hasn't explained variation in the data. Now, in this situation, that's actually great news, because if sex doesn't explain variation in the data, you can include males and females. There's no impact of sex. You've got a generalizable estimate. You build your conclusion space on that. So that's a reframing. And it's a belief in the value. They're believing I only include sex if I want to understand differences, not if I want to understand generalizability. So let's go back to this misconception. Female mice were inherently more variable. So this originally arose from an experiment where there was an open field experiment where they put mice in that were estrogen matched. They have a 3-day estrogen cycle. And they found that animals that were on the same day in their cycle had different behavior compared to the next day. And therefore, they felt that if we allowed animals to be at any stage in their estrogen cycle, there would be more variation in the data. So we needed to standardize. So there have been a number of meta-analyses where what they've taken is they've taken animals that are at any point in their estrogen cycle, and they've compared the females at any point, and they compared the variance for a trait against the variance for between the females and males. There is no systematic pattern. And in fact, in some of the analyses, the males tend to be more variable than the females. On balance, there is no pattern to the variation. We cannot inherently say female animals are more variable. Personally, on a personal level, to think that I am more variable depending on where it's stage in the cycle, I think is something I would like to push against as a society belief and to challenge. There's a second misconception that inclusion is at odds with the 3R mindset. Now, if we think about breeding, we produce both male and female animals, and currently it's calculated that with our focus on one sex, typically males, there are 25 million rodents that are overproduced a year worldwide. So, okay, we're throwing away a lot of animals, but people don't often count the animals in breeding. They focus on the number of animals they use within their own experiments. Now, when you use to conduct an experiment, when you use males and females, and if you use the right statistical toolkit, you're sharing the N across the males and females. And at that point, when you're sharing the N, you are being more efficient. You're not doubling the N, you just actually half the N and you share it. So it is more efficient to include the males and females within the same experiment. One, because you're going to share the information across to get that generalizable estimate, to then also be able to ask the question whether the effect depends on sex. If you try and first do it with males and then do it with females, the problem is that one, you never get round to the females, and two, you can't actually tell if the difference is due to sex. So you have to run it within the same experiment, but you can share the N. And we've seen a change in the definition of reduction anyway, which says we don't have to minimize the number of animals used exactly as within this experiment, within our cascade. So one, it is more efficient to include males and females at the same time, and two, you do not need to double the N anyway. So yes, the actual advice is for when you are not studying sex differences is just to share the N for your intervention effect. And while this might seem like a shocking idea, that this can't possibly be true, we published a paper in PLOS Biology in 2023 doing simulations to say, okay, we're going to set a situation where maybe there's a baseline difference in the sexes, maybe when there is an effect size different between the treatment effect, how does it play out on power? And what we showed is that you do not lose power to detect your average effect unless it happens in one and not the other, or it's in opposite directions. And at that point, you're finding out something really critical. So yes, these are the misconceptions that are at play. And the reason this misconception is at play is because to avoid the loss of power, you have to change your statistical toolkit. You move away from having a complete randomized design to a factorial design, where you have your first factor, which is your intervention of interest, and your second factor is sex. So if you can imagine, on the diagram on the left is a simple situation. You've got a control versus treatment group. This could be like a t-test. Your outcome variable, you're asking what is the effect of treatment, and you're asking how much that mean changes, and you're comparing it to the unexplained variance. When you have a factorial design, you're fitting a more complex model. You're going to ask, what is the effect of treatment after you've estimated how sex makes the readings higher or lower, and whether the effect depends on treatment. So your treatment effect is compared against the unexplained variance again, but you've accounted for the variance that comes from sex, and you've accounted for the interaction effect. But a lot of the time people think they're pooling the data. And of course it would add more variability to the data, but it's the wrong toolkit, or they're disaggregating the data. So the right statistical tools are essential. So the last thing is this fear of change. And we've already sort of touched on this. This is something that just needs directly challenging, and to naming that this is a fear, and that you have to, yes, you are fearful of this, but this isn't a reason to not make this change. So I was involved with the MRC to develop their new policy, which moved to inclusion and as the default. And they said, okay, we're putting out this new policy. We now need something to help the funding bodies. We need something to help the people evaluate these proposals and these justifications. And I sort of thought, okay, I think I can help here. I can do something here. So what I'm going to present now is the Sex Inclusive Research Framework, which is a nudge tool. It's to try and encourage people to truly reflect and move beyond the misconceptions to a reflective assessment of whether you can or can't include male and female samples. So I assembled a working group, and we drafted and tested a decision tree framework with supporting information. It was tested with some ethical review boards on project reviews. It was tested with the NC3Rs on a grant review cycle, and it was tested on a published dataset design justifications. And we went through cycles of refinement and testing to check the generalisability. It had people from many different organizations helping and assisting with this. We published the work in Nature Communications last year. And we also have a landing page where you can access the SURF and additional supporting information, like a video giving a talk like this, giving you case study examples, some frequently asked questions, etc. So what is the SURF? So reviewing bodies, which could be like an ethical board or a funding body, anybody, will need to assess the research proposal from a sex-inclusive position. And we know that many of the barriers are misconceptions, but we need more transparency in that decision-making process, and we need an educational resource to help people really consider it. So behavioural nudging. So it consists of 12 questions with supporting information. The supporting information gives advice to the people evaluating the proposal and an explanation of why the question exists. And it delivers a traffic outcome. So either green, your proposal is appropriate. Amber, there's some risks with your proposal. Either there's some risk possibly in your design or your analysis. Or red, your justification for single-sex studies is not sufficient. So, as we said, the framework is more than just a set of questions, because it is how to assess the answer and why this question and some supporting information. You can go to the website where there's an interactive framework where you can answer the questions, and it will then email a report to you that you can submit to your grant review cycle. Or you can download a PDF and operate offline. So this is what the diagram looks like. Let me see, get rid of that. And I'm not going to go through it in this form because this is quite hard to take it through this journey. But you can see there's a number of different ways you can navigate through this depending on how you answer the questions. And you get a variety of different green and yellow and red outcomes. So examples of when we get caution required. So if you're going to run an unbalanced design, so if 90% of your samples of one sex and 10% of the other, you're introducing generalisability or analysis challenges or risks. If you're going to run the experiment, but you don't think about how you're going to analyze the data and account for sex introducing variation in your data, you're introducing analysis risks. If you are going to study something that you say is a disease that affects males and females, but you can only induce it in males, there's a generalizability risk in your model at that point. Now, the decision to proceed is not that we say it can't proceed with these risks, because there might be some real reasons that you are carrying these risks. It could be that there is no other model. So what we do is we highlight the risk, and then it is up to the group to make a decision on how they wish to proceed. But here's an example. So a published justification was, in all the experiments, male and female litter mates will be pooled together and analysed as one group. So it is inclusive. The groups are statistically going to be compared, but you're not going to be able with that design to consider sex as a source of variation. So it's just raising a slight concern. On balance, it is a sex-inclusive design with a risk. Examples where you might get a red. It's not an appropriate justification. This could be when you're putting out misconceptions or statements that imply fear or avoiding change. So the published example is, we plan to use male mice, as female mice tend to have twice the level of circulating cortisol as males, and these levels may shift in response to the stage in the estrogen cycle. So it isn't an inclusive design. The sex can be determined. It isn't what we call an acceptable exception, which you can find out more in the paperwork. It isn't a disease model induction issue. It is a statement about variability. They are saying there's a baseline shift in cortisol. Well, that's okay. Just use the right statistical toolkit. And then they're saying the level may shift. That's a fear statement. There's no evidence that the level is going to bend. And there's no evidence that it's changing enough to decrease the power. So this is a fear statement. So this is a single sex not appropriately justified. What about a green? The proposal is appropriately as an appropriate outcome. So it could be a single sex study, or it could be such as the one on the left. So here, female mice are implanted with patient-derived ovarian cancer tumors. Okay, this is a cancer that can only occur in females. This is an acceptable exception on question 3. So yes, a single sex study is justified. On the right, it's showing an example that goes all the way down to question 9, which is, it's a single sex study, but they have put forward a measured reflection arguing why they cannot run an inclusive design. And so that would be, if you agree with their measured reflection, then it is a single sex study is justified. So here's an example of what would come out of the software if you'd answered the questions, and you would be able to submit it with your proposal. So that's the tool. But now I want to switch topics. And I want to switch topics to is, can we understand better what is driving behavior? And so this work was published last year in eLife, which was a research project on how we conduct on the scientists themselves. So I had the opportunity to go to a conference and deliver a workshop, and they asked me to write a manuscript after the conference on the workshop. And I thought, well, I only like writing something if it's something new to say. So I thought, well, we can make this workshop into an experiment. What we can do is we can run a parallel group design. We can test people who generally come to the conference. We can test people who go to a symposium on sex as a biological variable, and we can test people who attend the workshop. And then we can see if there's any difference in their beliefs, their attitudes, their knowledge around the topic. So the workshop was a 2-hour workshop with some lectures, some interactive activities, exploring the SURF framework and doing some multiple choice discussion questions. And what we were looking to do was to make them aware that they were changing expectation, to challenge the misconceptions, to link them to new resources, to upskill in design consideration and upskill in data analysis. And we ran this first at a conference, and then we ran it again at an academic university in London with a pre-post design. So we tested people before, we did the workshop, and then after to see would the results recapitulate. So we were looking to capture and quantify the scale of the misconceptions, because nothing has been published on what is the proportion of the population that think these things, to assess whether the intervention leads to an improvement in knowledge, to explore the drivers of intention. So we can't measure the behavior to include two sexes. It takes us too long. What we can measure is their intention to include both sexes. We can assess the impact of the intervention on intention. Okay, so we can do that using a survey. A survey, in this case, had 39 questions. So it starts with consent, inclusion criteria, demographic information. Then we ask, what's their current experience of inclusion? What are the advantages? What are the barriers? And then we have 5 questions about what do they know in the analysis and design. Then we have a series of questions based on the theory of planned behavior. And these questions are trying to mathematically to quantify their intention, their attitude, the belief of whether this behavior matters, the belief that they have control over the behavior, so behavioral control, and their belief on what do they think everyone else thinks about inclusive research. So does anybody else care? And the idea behind the theory of planned behavior is you want to know about behavior, but you can't measure it, but we can measure intention. And intention is driven by an intersecting group of behaviors or beliefs or attitudes, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control. So how does this work? How does a survey give you a metric for how well my perceived control? So you ask a question and then you give an answer and you give a score to that answer. And then you're going to average those scores. So there are 3 questions here for behavioral control. The first question says, I feel confident in my ability to include males and females. The second question says, whether or not I include males and females is up to me. The third one says, overall, using males and females in an experiment is easy or hard. So you can get a mathematical number for, you get the 3 questions, you average them, you now have a score for their perceived control over running inclusive designs, and so forth. So under the knowledge, we had 5 questions. They had, we could answer them as yes, sometimes no, don't know. Only one of those options is right, so that would score a 1. Everything else scores a 0. So you can get how many questions did they get right, and you can get a cumulative score across the 5. And so these are some things like, do you need to double the sample size to include both sexes? Do you think sex influences data variability? The questions of whether stats is causing the problem. Okay, so here's study 1. So what we've got on the y-axis is intention. So the higher the number, the better. And then we've got on the x-axis the other theory of planned behavior variables. So we can see in this that on the left there, as their attitude, the belief that sex matters increases, so does their intention. On behavioral control, there's nothing, the correlation is just a bit noisy there. In social norm, again, we're seeing a positive correlation. When they perceive other people care, they have higher intention. In study 2, we see slightly different results. Now, I will explore a bit more in that. In study 1, had data from people we just sprung on in the group. We just met them. Whereas in study 2, these were people who had chosen to come to the course. So they already had high intention. So that's why there's difference. So we showed that the intervention had an impact on intention in study 1, but not in study 2. probably because their intention score was already very high. We found that following the intervention, the barriers were no longer selected. The barriers that we had targeted were no longer selected. The barriers that we didn't target stayed the same. There was no statistical difference. The perceived benefits, there's a challenge because everybody thinks the benefits of inclusion is to find sex differences. So they don't understand the benefit of generalisability. And therefore, that's at odds of sharing the N. The intervention had a significant impact on knowledge. We could see across the board in both studies. And if you look at the barriers, the most cited barriers are perception of cost. The third responder was misconceptions, and the local culture was also impacting the perceived barriers. So in London, they were very worried about aggressive male animals because they have more attention focused on that topic. So you can find a barrier that is very local to a community. So some things to pull out here. The scale of misconceptions was staggering. Over 80% of people thought data could be pooled. Around 80% of beta thought the data should be disaggregated. Around 80% of people thought inclusion would double the N. 90% of people thought inclusive designs increase variance and hence the N. Most researchers knew that sex shouldn't be included in the model, but basically they didn't know how to do it. But none of them selected that they were concerned with how to analyze the data. So I think we have a Dunning-Kruger's effect, which is you don't really recognize one's own incompetence, which is I don't know how to do statistical analysis when things get a little bit more complicated. And that's playing out. So the next steps that we've got already active is I'm working with COST, which is a European initiative and has a sex as a biological variable. And we're about to launch, probably this month, the SURF Up, which is a program targeting ethical review boards. And again, it's wrapped with a survey to assess the impact. And if you want to encourage people to sign up, then they can become consortium authors on this work as we move forward on this. So in conclusion, what I've been trying to do is to weaken the resisting forces and strengthen or help the funding bodies strengthen their driving forces with the practical tools and actually tackling those misconceptions that you're going to double the animal use. Make it, it's not true. Here's the evidence. That is not a real thing. So we are in the midst of what I would argue is a paradigm shift, and expectations are changing. But there's a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions and challenges, both in thinking about how you design experiments, why you're doing it, how to analyze the data, how to present, how to do the conclusions on it. So there's a lot of things that we need to support the community to enable them to do this. Scientists believe it matters. So it is not a belief issue. So telling them it is important won't work. We have to focus on why they're not doing the behavior. And training alone will be insufficient because we have to change those behavioral paths and the perceived cultural norms to actually enable this new way of working. So that's more of where we need to focus. So my question to you as a community is, where else can we add nudges to change the cultural norms and the behavioral paths? And that is a whirlwind of world of work with many people from around the world. Some of these I've pulled out here, particularly Brianna, who helped me with the survey. And yes, that's the end of my talk.
Wonderful. Many thanks, Natasha. This is, again, I never get tired of listening to your presentation. So really, really appreciate it.